What's going on, guys? Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent, and this is the second review in our kind of desert theme this week. The first one was Underworld by Don DeLillo, although that mostly takes place in New York, but I just felt like talking about stuff in the desert. So, The Delicate Prey by Paul Bowles. What seems like forever ago, back in 2013, before my dad got sick, I was doing a little bit of work in Spain and visiting Barcelona for the first time with my good friend John, and we were wandering around the Gothic neighborhoods and districts and drinking too much wine and spending too much money and seeing what we could find. Two expats trying their hardest not to go back to the States. John got wind that his family friend was willing to do a trade deal if I were to do a promotional video at his riad in the middle of Marrakesh in exchange for some vacation time there in it. So, if we struck this deal, free room and board for a couple of weeks in exchange for promotional materials. So I said, hell yeah. Having never dreamed of going to North Africa, I decided this was the best deal in the world. So my compatriot and I took a bus down the Spanish coast to Algeciras and took a ferry from there because we decided we wanted to do this the hard way. And it dumped us out on the coast of North Africa about 45 minutes by taxi out of Tangiers. And Tangiers was a shit show. A completely overly aggressive swarm of screaming taxi drivers as soon as we stepped off of this bus. We made it to the train station kind of fairly unscathed and took a 9-hour train from Tangiers to Marrakesh. We were sleeping in these cheap linen suits in the heat. There was no bed, there was nothing. There was no food, there was no water, there was just... I think maybe there was like some guy who came in on this like shabby cart like that might have had like Pringles or Oreos or something, and there it would stop at all these sketchy towns in the middle of the landscape between these two cities, and these guys would just get on and off in the middle of the night who were like dudes who you definitely don't want to be stuck on a train with at night. And I'll never forget looking out the train window at the moonlit landscape of the North African desert and just thinking, where the fuck am I? So we arrive in Marrakesh the next morning, and however crazy I thought Tangiers was, Marrakesh is batshit insane. Men are like violently arguing with their donkeys that are stuck in traffic along with taxis, and these grandmothers are riding motorcycles that have like 5 kids on them right next to you. Children who are screaming at you in French asking for money and stuff. Men who wanted to kill me just because I had my camera out. The call to prayer echoing across the landscape throughout the city every 5 minutes it seemed. One guy was carrying a peacock on his back. Like literally, like a live peacock. So like the head went all the way down here, and then it trailed up because of the long neck right next to his ass. So it was able to kind of like look around, like this periscope. It just made no sense. So we stayed in this riad in the middle of Marrakesh, and we wandered throughout the cavernous streets of the Medina with all of the guys selling their wares, and the women in these bright colored cloths, getting in arguments with snake charmers and haggling with old people for stuff, getting a feel for this world that Paul Bowles inhabited. Bowles was actually suggested to me while I was over there by another friend of mine, and I found several of his books at this riad in English, luckily for me. Everybody speaks French over there, or, Arabic. I've reviewed The Sheltering Sky, although admittedly not very well and also a long time ago, and I hope that doesn't keep you from reading it, because that is his most well-known book, his most well-known novel, and it's wonderful, Sheltering Sky. Bowles is unlike anybody else around. So I wanted to see the Sahara Desert, and like a tourist, I packed in this cramped, hot little bus with all these other tourists and wandered out to the border of Algiers, in the middle of nowhere, traveling 2 hours by camel through these dunes to get to this Berber tent, staying overnight and exploring the shifting terrain under the stars. I had this dream filled with violence, and William S. Burroughs was in it out there, and it was this atmosphere of harshness that just permeates everything, It was very, very interesting. It was very intense. Things weren't as bad as they are now, and I probably wouldn't go over at the moment with all the political tension. While I was over there filming, I was stopped by authorities with like assault rifles in the Medina, and I was next to like the King's Palace or something that should not be filmed. I had no idea. It looked like everything else. And they actually looked through my camera and told me to delete X, Y, and Z, and I was like, oh, okay, no problem. On the way to the Sahara on that bus, I read The Delicate Prey. And somehow it stuck in my consciousness for 3 years, and maybe that's why I developed this sort of impression of the culture and the environment as harsh. It's beautiful and it's intense and it's gorgeous and stunning, but it's also very there's this undercurrent of tension, heavy tension, and this struggle. There's a buildup in the narrative very similar to the work of Edgar Allan Poe, and of course I wasn't surprised to find out that he is a big fan of Poe. And I'm working through Poe right now, and I can see there's obvious similarities. So I hope you enjoy this deeply disturbing, beautiful short story. And I hope that you make it over to North Africa at some point in your life, regardless of your background or your gender. It's absolutely worth it. You should go if you can, even with all this controversy between radical Islam and the West. There is something fascinating and beautiful about a culture that ancient and so radically different from ours. And you have to see the Sahara at least once in your life. At least once. So go check it out, be safe, be smart, and don't take the trains. And remember that life is too short to read bullshit. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Talk to you soon. Have a good week. Ciao. Hello and welcome to the Better Than Food podcast, located here in the BTF studios in my hot-ass bedroom. My name is Clifford Lee Sargent, and today I'm going to be reading The Delicate Prey by Paul Bowles for all y'all. So let's get started. There were 3 Falala who sold leather in Tabalba, 2 brothers and the young son of their sister. The 2 older merchants were serious, bearded men who liked to engage in complicated theological discussions during the slow passage of the hot hours in their anut near the marketplace. The youth naturally occupied himself almost exclusively with the black-skinned girls in the small quartier réservé. There was one who seemed more desirable than the others, so that he was a little sorry when the older men announced that soon they would all leave for Thessaly. But nearly every town has its quartier, and Driss was reasonably certain of being able to have any lovely resident of any quartier, whatever her present emotional entanglements. Thus, his chagrin at hearing of the projected departure was short-lived. The 3 Falala waited for the cold weather before starting out for Thessaly. Because they wanted to get there quickly, they chose the westernmost trail, which is also the one leading through the most remote regions, contiguous to the lands of the plundering Regiba tribes. It was a long time since the uncouth mountain men had swept down from the Hamada upon a caravan. Most people were of the opinion that since the War of the Sorrow, they had lost the greater part of their arms and ammunition, and, more important still, their spirit. And a tiny group of 3 men and their camels could scarcely awaken the envy of the Regiba, traditionally rich with loot from all the Rio de Oro and Mauritania. Their friends in Tabalba, most of them other Filali leather merchants, walked beside them sadly as far as the edge of the town. Then they bade them farewell and watched them mount their camels to ride off slowly toward the bright horizon. "If you meet any Regiba, keep them ahead of you," they called. The danger lay principally in the territory they would reach only 3 or 4 days' journey from Tabalba. After a week, the edge of the land haunted by the Regiba would be left entirely behind. The weather was cool, save at midday. They took turns sitting guard at night. When Driss stayed awake, he brought out a small flute whose piercing notes made the older uncle frown with annoyance, so that he asked him to go and sit at some distance from the sleeping blankets. All night he sat playing whatever sad songs he could call to mind. The bright ones, in his opinion, belonged to the quartier, where one was never alone. When the uncles kept watch, they sat quietly, staring ahead of them into the night. There were just the 3 of them. And then one day a solitary figure appeared, moving toward them across the lifeless plain from the west, 1 man on a camel. There was no sign of any others, although they scanned the wasteland in every direction. They stopped for a while. He altered his course slightly. They went ahead. He changed it again. There was no doubt that he wanted to speak with them. "Let him come," grumbled the older uncle, glaring about the empty horizon once more. "We each have a gun." Driss laughed. To him it seemed absurd even to admit the possibility of trouble from one lone man. When finally the figure arrived within calling distance, it hailed them in a voice like a muezzin's. "Salam alaikum." They halted,
but did not dismount, and waited for the man to draw nearer. Soon he called again. This time the older uncle replied, but the distance was still too great for his voice to carry, and the man did not hear his greeting. Presently, he was close enough for them to see that he did not wear Reggiba attire. They muttered to one another, "He comes from the north, not the west," and they all felt glad. However, even when he came up beside them, they remained on the camels, bowing solemnly from where they sat, and always searching in the new face and in the garments below it for some false note, which might reveal the possible truth that the man was a scout for the Reggiba, who would be waiting up on the Hamada only a few hours distant, or even now moving parallel to the trail, closing in upon them in such a manner that they would not arrive at a point with invisibility until after dusk. Certainly the stranger himself was no Reggiba. He was quick and jolly, with light skin and very little beard. It occurred to Driss that he did not like his small, active eyes, which seemed to take in everything and give out nothing, but this passing reaction became only a part of the general initial distrust, all of which was dissipated when they learned that the man was a Maungari. Maungar is a holy place in that part of the world, and its few residents are treated with respect by the pilgrims who go to visit the ruined shrine nearby. The newcomer took no pains to hide the fear he had felt at being alone in the region, or the pleasure it gave him to be now with 3 other men. They all dismounted and made tea to seal their friendship, the Maungari furnishing the charcoal. During the 3rd round of glasses, he made the suggestion that since he was going more or less in their direction, he accompanied them as far as Todani. His bright black eyes darting from one filali to the other, he explained that he was an excellent shot, that he was certain he could supply them all with some good gazelle meat en route, or at least an odad. The filala considered. The oldest finally said, "Agreed." Even if the Maungari turned out to have not quite the hunting prowess he claimed for himself, there would be 4 of them on the voyage instead of 3. 2 mornings later, in the mighty silence of the rising sun, the Maungari pointed at the low hills that lay beside them to the east. "Tima, I know this land. Wait here. If you hear me shoot, then come, because that will mean there are gazelles." The Maungari went off on foot, climbing up between the boulders and disappearing behind the nearest crest. "He trusts us," thought the Falala. "He has left his mehari, his blankets, his packs." They said nothing, but each knew that the others were thinking the same as he, and they all felt warmly toward the stranger. They sat waiting in the early morning chill while the camels grumbled. It seemed unlikely that there would prove to be any gazelles in this region, but if there should be any, and the Maungari were as good a hunter as he claimed to be, then there was a chance that they would have a mejoui of gazelle that evening, and that would be very fine. Slowly the sun mounted in the hard blue sky. One camel lumbered up and went off, hoping to find a dead thistle or a bush between the rocks, something left over from a year when rain might have fallen. When it had disappeared, Driss went in search of it and drove it back to the others, shouting, "Hut!" He sat down. Suddenly there came a shot, a long, empty interval, and then another shot. The sounds were fairly distant, but perfectly clear in the absolute silence. The older brother said, "I shall go. Who knows? There may be many gazelles." He clambered up the rocks, his gun in his hand, and was gone. Again they waited. When the shots sounded this time, they came from 2 guns. "Perhaps they have killed one," Driss cried. "Yemkin, with Allah's aid," replied his uncle, rising and taking up his gun. "I want to try my hand at this." Driss was disappointed. He had hoped to go himself. If only he had got up a moment ago, it might have been possible, but even so, it was likely that he would have been left behind to watch the Mehara. In any case, now it was too late. His uncle had spoken. Good. His uncle went off, singing a song from Tafilale. It was about date palms and hidden smiles. For several minutes, Driss heard snatches of the song as the melody reached the high notes, and then the sound was lost in the enveloping silence. He waited. The sun began to be very hot. He covered his head with his burnous. The camels looked at each other stupidly, craning their necks, baring their brown and yellow teeth. He thought of playing his flute, but it did not seem right at the moment. He was too restless, too eager to be up there with his gun, crouching behind the rocks, stalking the delicate prey. He thought of Thessaly and wondered what it would be like, full of blacks and Tuareg, certainly more lively than Tebelba, because of the road that passed through it. There was a shot. He waited for others, but no more came this time. Again he imagined himself up there among the boulders, taking aim at a fleeing beast. He pulled the trigger. The animal fell. Others appeared, and he got them all. In the dark, the travelers sat around the fire, gorging themselves with the rich roasted flesh, their faces gleaming with grease, Everyone was happy, and even the Mungari admitted that the young Filali was the best hunter of them all. In the advancing heat he dozed, his mind playing over a landscape made of soft thighs and small, hard breasts rising like sand dunes. Wisps of song floated like clouds in the sky, and the air was thick with the taste of fat gazelle meat. He sat up and looked around quickly. The camels lay with their necks stretched along the ground in front of them. Nothing had changed. He stood up, uneasily scanned the stony landscape. While he had slept, a hostile presence had entered into his consciousness. Translating into thought what he had already sensed, he cried out. Since first he had seen those small, active eyes, he had felt mistrust of their owner, but the fact that his uncles had accepted him had pushed his suspicion away into the dark of his mind. Now, unleashed in his slumber, it had bounded back. He turned toward the hot hillside and looked intently between the boulders, into the black shadows. In memory, he had heard again the shots up among the rocks, and he knew what they had meant. Catching his breath in a sob, he ran to mount his Mahari, force it up, and already had gone several hundred paces before he was aware of what he was doing. He stopped the animal to sit quietly a moment, glancing back at the campsite with fear and indecision. If his uncles were dead, then there was nothing to do but to get out in the open desert as quickly as possible, away from the rocks, so that he could hide the Mangari while he took aim. And so, not knowing the way to Thessaly, and without sufficient food or water, he started ahead, lifting one hand from time to time to wipe away the tears. For 2 or 3 hours he continued that way, scarcely noticing where the Mahari walked. All at once he sat erect, uttered an oath against himself, and in a fury turned the beast around. At that very moment his uncles might be seated in the camp with the Mangari, preparing a meshui and a fire, sadly asking themselves why their nephew had deserted them. Or perhaps one would already have set out in search of him. There would be no possible excuse for his conduct, which had been the result of an absurd terror. As he thought about it, his anger against himself mounted. He had behaved in an unforgivable manner. Noon had passed. The sun was in the west. It would be late when he got back. At the prospect of the inevitable reproaches and the mocking laughter that would greet him, he felt his face grow hot with shame, and he kicked the Mahari's flanks viciously. A good while before he arrived at the camp he heard singing. This surprised him. He halted and listened. The voice was too far away to be identified, but Driss felt certain it was the Mangari's. He continued around the side of the hill to have a spot in full view of the camels. The singing stopped, leaving silence. Some of the packs had been loaded back onto the beasts, preparatory to setting out. The sun had sunk low, and the shadows of the rocks were stretched out along the earth. There was no sign that they had caught any game. He called out, ready to dismount. Almost at the same instant, there was a shot from very nearby, and he heard the small rushing sound of a bullet go past his head. He seized his gun. There was another shot. A sharp pain in his arm, and his gun slipped to the ground. For a moment he sat there, holding his arm, dazed. Then swiftly he leapt down and remained crouching among the stones, reaching out with his good arm for the gun. As he touched it, there was a third shot, and the rifle moved along the ground a few inches toward him in a small cloud of dust. He drew back his hand and looked at it. It was dark, and blood dripped from it. At that moment the Mangari bounded across the open space between them. Before Driss could rise, the man was upon him, had pushed him back down to the ground with the barrel of his rifle. The untroubled sky lay above. The Mangari glanced up at it defiantly. He straddled the supine youth, thrusting the gun into his neck just below the chin, and under his breath he said, "Filali, dog!" Driss stared up at him with a certain curiosity. The Mangari had the upper hand. Driss could only wait. He looked at the face in the sun's light and discovered a peculiar intensity there. He knew the expression. It comes from hashish. Carried along on its hot fumes, a man can escape very far from the world of meaning. To avoid the malevolent face, he rolled his eyes from side to side. There was only the fading sky. The gun was choking him a little. He whispered, "Where are my uncles?" The Mangari pushed harder against his throat with the gun, leaned partially over, and with one hand ripped away his suruel so that he lay naked from the waist down, squirming a little as he felt the cold stones beneath him. Then the Mangari drew forth a rope and bound his feet. Taking 2 steps to his head, he abruptly faced in the other direction and thrust the gun into his navel. Still, with one hand, he slipped the remaining garments over the youth's head and lashed his wrists together. With an old barber's razor, he cut off the superfluous rope. During this time, Driss called his uncles by name, loudly, first one and then the other. The man moved and surveyed the young body lying on the stones. He ran his finger along the razor's blade. A pleasant excitement took possession of him. He stepped over, looked down, and saw the sex that sprouted from the base of the belly. Not entirely conscious of what he was doing, he took it in one hand and brought his other arm down with the motion of a reaper wielding a sickle. It was swiftly severed. A round, dark hole was left, flush with the skin. He stared a moment blankly. Driss was screaming. The muscles all over his body stood out, moved. Slowly the Mungari smiled, showing his teeth. He put his hand on the hard belly and smoothed the skin. Then he made a small vertical incision there, and using both hands studiously stuffed the loose organ in until it disappeared. As he was cleaning his hands in the sand, one of the camels uttered a sudden growling gurgle. The Mungari leapt up and wheeled about savagely, holding his razor high in the air. Then, ashamed of his nervousness, feeling that Driss was watching and mocking him, although the youth's eyes were unseeing with pain, he kicked him over onto his stomach where he lay, making small spasmodic movements, and as the Mungari followed these with his eyes, a new idea came to him. It would be pleasant to inflict an ultimate indignity upon the young Filali. He threw himself down. This time he was vociferous and leisurely in his enjoyment. Eventually, he slept. At dawn, he awoke and reached for his razor lying on the ground nearby. Driss moaned faintly. The Mungari turned him over and pushed the blade back and forth with a sawing motion into his neck until he was certain he had severed the windpipe. Then he rose, walked away, and finished the loading of the camels he had started the day before. When this was done, he spent a good while dragging the body over to the base of the hill and concealing it there among the rocks. In order to transport the Filala's merchandise to Thessaly, for in Taudeni there would be no buyers, it was necessary to take their Mehara with him. It was nearly 50 days later when he arrived. Thessaly is a small town. When the Mungari began to show the leather around, an old Filali living there, whom the people called Shibani, got wind of his presence. As a prospective buyer, he came in to examine the hides, and the Mungari was unwise enough to let him see them. Filali leather is unmistakable, and only the Filala buy and sell it in quantity. Shibani knew that the Mungari had come by it illicitly, and he had said nothing. When, a few days later, another caravan arrived from Tabalba, with friends of the three Filala, who asked after them and showed great distress on hearing that they had never had arrived, the old man went to the tribunal. After some difficulty, he found a Frenchman who was willing to listen to him. The next day, the commandant and two subordinates paid the Mungari a visit. They asked him how he happened to have the 3 extra Mehara, which still carried some of their Filali trappings. His replies took a devious turn. The Frenchman listened seriously, thanked him, and left. He did not see the commandant wink at the others as they went out into the street. And so he remained sitting in his courtyard, not knowing that he had been judged and found guilty. The 3 Frenchmen went back to the tribunal, where the newly arrived Filali merchants were sitting with Ekshibani. The story had an old pattern. There was no doubt at all about the Mungari's guilt. "He is yours," said the commandant. "Do what you like with him." The Filala thanked him profusely, held a short conference with the aged Shibani, and strode out in a group. When they arrived at the Mungari's dwelling, he was making tea. He looked up, and a chill moved along his spine. He began to scream his innocence at them. They said nothing, but at the point of a rifle bound him and tossed him into a corner, where he continued to babble and sob. Quietly they drank the tea that he had been brewing, made some more, and went out at twilight. They tied him to one of the Mahara, and mounting their own, moved in a silent procession, silent save for the Mungari, out through the town gate into the infinite wasteland beyond. Half the night they continued until they were in a completely unfrequented region of the desert. While he lay raving, bound to the camel, they dug a well-like pit, and when they had finished they lifted him off, still trussed tightly, and stood him in it. Then they filled all the space around his body with sand and stones, until only his head remained above the earth's surface. In the faint light of the new moon, his shaved pate without its turban looked rather like a rock. And still he pleaded with them, calling upon Allah and Sidi Ahmed ben Musa to witness his innocence. But he might have been singing a song for the attention they paid to his words. Presently they set off for Thessaly. In no time they were out of hearing. When they had gone, the Mungari fell silent, to wait through the cold hours for the sun that would bring first warmth, then heat, thirst, fire, visions. The next night he did not know where he was, did not feel the cold. The wind blew dust along the ground into his mouth as he sang.